to say before we open it up, I do think the point that both my colleagues to my left, actually, I don't think you're officially to my left, but both my colleagues to my left said about really thinking about what schooling is for and starting with that. Because if we think about what we're supposed to be doing in schools, we have to help kids develop trusting relationships with their peers and with adults. We have to create not just a sense of joy and inquiry, but helping kids be able to apply knowledge and critically think, not just know things. And that's also been a huge shift. And, you know, whether you agree or disagree with the Common Core, the strategy of the Common Core is supposed to be about that strand, about critical thinking. And the third is this whole notion of persistence and grit. And I think you said it, more than almost anything else, if rich kids have more means and their parents have more means to deal with something when a kid stumbles than poor kids, white, black, or Latino. And so if we actually started thinking about what we need to do for kids in those three buckets, then it becomes pretty easy to move away from a hyper testing policy or to move away from a zero tolerance policy or move away from any of these kind of sanction-based policies, because we have a different definition of what schooling is supposed to be and what constitutes success. Mm-hmm. And I think, Keith, when you said that about it, it just kind of hit me that part of this is we are looking at an accountability system that really is also outdated for this day and age. And I think so I think that would help us if we started thinking about it more broadly about what are the purposes of schools and what is our goal for all kids. So when I say those three things, we're not talking about help kids get to their potential. We're talking about everybody can see, think, feel, and say, how do we get there for all of our kids? Sorry, Bernie.
Thank you. Questions?
I want to talk a little bit about how this plays out in a community, because I've had some experience, and actually what Randy was talking about, one of the best communities in the United States that Randy even mentioned, Syracuse, New York, where they have all the supports for people, and they have counselors in every school and all kinds of things that aren't available in other places. And yet, when they push the zero tolerance, when they push a new type of discipline policy, the first thing that happens is there are community meetings where blacks are on one side of the room and the whites are on the other side of the room, and no white person was on the other side of the room supporting the families that are pushing for these rights. And so I'm just saying that there's a huge racial dimension that's happening in all of our communities, that this is, they're afraid to have the kids in the schools. There's more resegregation than we've ever seen. And so, I just want to talk about the value of having union leaders on the front lines talking about this and standing with the minority community. But other people, we need business people, we need other people. The superintendent asked me, what do I do to get the white people to help support this effort? And, she is in a very strange position because she's being sued by the black community for the problems, and she wants to bring the white community out to support it. It's a very challenging situation.
That's a great question, very practical question. What I would do is sort of just start small, because remember I was talking about the whole zero-sum thing? That we got this dynamic where people believe that if you do something for this one, you're taking something from me. So, and it's not true, right? And if you were to actually go get all the white kids who are zero policy, you'd have a crew. You'd have people there. So you got to start small before you have the big community meeting. But you got to have that community meeting, and you got to let people yell it out. But then you need to have some data, and then you need to say we're gonna hold hands and move this thing together. And you are not going to get everybody, but I guarantee you, after you implement the process, everybody's going to feel a little bit better about it. And another thing I want to say is that, look, when I was a kid growing up in Detroit, Michigan, there was a certain sense that we needed to do some black-white healing, solidarity, and people got together in churches and we don't do that no more. We just assume, oh, everybody's cool. We don't have segregation, so fine. And yet, institutionally, that you just put your finger on it. So I do believe we need to continue the struggle of racial healing, but we need to break out of it, because one thing I'm sure about, and I know this because, yes, African Americans got hit harder by foreclosure, but a lot of white people call my office too. And yes, there's probably more healthcare access problems with people of color, but a lot of white people have those problems too. We don't live in this strict black versus white Jim Crow 1953 America. And one thing that has happened as we have made progress on the racial front, and we have made some, we've actually, I feel, lost ground on the economic front with wage stagnation and everything else. And so you're going to see more technicolor poverty. And so we've got to be bold, brave, persistent.
If you could identify yourself before the question.
This is Alex Medler. I'm with the National Association of Charter School Authorizers. Within this, totally hats off to you for the thought leadership in this issue. One of the things we find interesting in the charter school world are schools that are focusing specifically on very at-risk kids like Maya Angelou. But we also have a lot of dumping grounds where people have created alternatives that are not effective and not good. I'd be curious if you could speak to the role of, while we also work in all our schools to fix this problem, what's the role for alternative education campuses, and how do we distinguish between the ones that are saving kids' lives and the ones that are warehousing them until we get them into prison?
Yeah, well, thank you for asking that question. It's important and it's challenging. I mean, I have seen this firsthand since I moved to New Haven, Connecticut, and I didn't mention this, but one of the things I do now is I run a clinic at Yale where we represent kids in expulsion hearings in Connecticut. So, and just on this point, I mean, just a month ago we had a white kid from a fairly integrated but majority white district, possession of marijuana. School moved to expel. It got it. 100 days, gone, 100 days. But on this, the other thing that I've seen is the biggest, so New Haven doesn't have some of these expelling kids for really kind of minor things that you read about, and there's that county in Florida, and but what New Haven has is the kids that they do put out of school for more than 10 days get referred to these alternative placements, which are 2 hours a day. And the kid who's been expelled, the courts have held, does not have a right. You lose your right to an education. So whatever the kid gives you, whatever the district gives you during that period of expulsion is basically a matter of grace. Now, they get 2 hours a day so these are kids that are already behind, because by and large, kids that are getting expelled, I mean, you get your honor roll case and that's in the paper, but the bulk of these are kids that are struggling in other dimensions as well. And I mean, I have two clients that are 12 years old who have been put out of school for almost 180 days, and what they get is 2 hours a day in a different building, further from their home. They got to do their own transportation, and they were already behind, and now they're going to do what with 2 hours a day? Right. Okay, so that's alternative education as well. I think that the alternative schools have to be judged by a set of metrics. They're not exactly the same things. There has to be more flexibility. There has to be more discretion. There has to be a particular emphasis on trying to measure growth. There has to be a particular emphasis on measuring certain things like leading indicators like re-engagement. So what is the attendance rate for a kid that hadn't been going to school? The attendance rate is, incredibly important. Things like that. Some of these broader school climate measures that we're talking about, how safe do kids feel in school? Those are things that are very important in evaluating alternative schools. So I think, your organization and some of the other organizations, I think, are doing good work on trying to identify, okay, we need a different set of measures for alternative schools, but we have to have a set of measures. And let's apply them. And I actually think when you do apply them, you can start to pretty quickly see some real differences in school quality. Now, that shouldn't be, the numbers can't be the be-all and the end-all. That has to be followed up with more qualitative in-person visits. But I think when you put all of that together, that to me is what kind of assessment and measurement of alternative schools looks like.
But I want to just actually be a little bit controversial, which is I would actually like to see, and I say this as someone who started 2.5 charter schools in New York, one of which is doing extraordinarily well and one of which, has had its struggles. But I'd actually like to see the public schools not become the alternative schools to the charters, meaning that when charters have some disciplinary issues, you see those kids in other traditional public schools. I'd like to start seeing charters actually try to do the same work that we're asking traditional public schools to do. And I think that that would go a long way to also diffusing the tension between charters and traditional neighborhood public schools.
Now, Randy has an unexpected invitation to a meeting at the White House, and we'll have to leave in 1 minute.
No, we have 5, and it's
You
not
have 5,
unexpected.
okay.
We've known.
All
but
right.
We wanted to push
Okay.
this, but thank you.
So I'd like to take
We have
these
5 minutes.
next 2 questions. So,
Sean Hartnett, and I'm with
I don't mind being late for this reason.
Center City Public Charter Schools here in D.C. Difficult discussion, so much so you've lost your skirt.
But we're still at the table.
Well, I really appreciate that. And thank you to AFT and the Institute for hosting. I've had the pleasure of working as a teacher, Rochester, New York, Buffalo, New York, New York City, Houston, Texas, Washington, D.C., and San Francisco. Washington, D.C. is by far the most litigious environment I've ever been. So I know that I started teaching when the proliferation of zero tolerance kind of kicked up. I'm sorry. Should I hold it? Just hold it. There we go. So I started teaching when the proliferation of zero tolerance kind of kicked in. And I know that it wasn't an intent to have what we have today. But we are more outcome oriented in our analysis, which is why I think it's dismantling. One of the things that you said this, over-reliance on punitive measures. It rang inside me in a different way, and I'd like you to consider this as you all move forward. I think that AFT and the Department of Ed need to get together on a study on the impact of these laws inside schools in terms of what the decisions that teachers make because of it. Right now, teachers are afraid to do anything in schools. And then we get an announcement that it's now, you're going to be able to be, I don't know what this means, this law. Will we be now jailed for discriminatory practices in suspending kids, right? It sounds great and it needs to be done, but the practice and how it will hit schools, what people will hear, I am concerned that it's going to turn into people not making decisions that they need to make because they're afraid of an over-reliance on punitive measures where teachers are concerned. Because we have advocates in our schools every day in DC, and now we'll have more of them because we now are saying that it is, I guess we've discriminated. And yes, those policies are discriminatory in their outcomes, they are. But I'm just concerned about how we make sure that the promotion and the transition to this new set of rules and policies doesn't lead to teachers and administrators feeling afraid and then therefore not making appropriate choices for kids.
That climate issue is something that we're seeing around the country, where teachers have, because of the test fixation and things like that, there is more deprofessionalization these days than probably I've ever seen, certainly in the 20 or so years that I've been engaged in education. So, but I do think that the issue, as people were talking, I wrote to myself, we need more John Deweys and less John Waynes. And because if you think about what Keith said, all of these policies, whether you're talking about stop and frisk, whether you're talking about mandatory sentencing for drugs, whether you're talking about, factorization based upon test scores, whether you're talking about zero tolerance, all of them basically say we don't trust the professionals anywhere to do anything, and we're going to have these bright lines. And I think that if we could actually, and this is where I would go back to the federal government, if we actually married the new policy initiatives with real resources and made it clear that real resources and supports are absolutely imperative, the things that James talked about, the things that Keith talked about, the things that I've talked about, and created some trust, you would see things like we're seeing in Peoria, Illinois, where we're working, where you see a real decrease in suspensions and expulsions based upon people having the discretion and the resources to have things like guidance counselors and interventions that I, as a school teacher, may not know how to do. So I think that and we see it in Broward County, we see it in Baltimore, and we saw it in the stats I just talked about in terms of Minnesota. But this is also on the feds to marry with this compelling data on what has happened, some not just online guidance, but real fight for resources so that we can actually create environments are absolutely essential to create. Your point is that also absolutely imperative. If we don't actually show models that are working based upon resources and interventions, then what's going to happen is the situation is going to
Can I ask a question of the gentleman in the panel? Would your view and your concern be different if we were to say, okay, we're going to ask teachers what they think a new discipline policy would look like that's more graduated, has more options available for the teacher? You understand what I'm saying? I mean, part of, I think, what might be concerning you, and of course I don't know, that's why I'm asking you, is that like this is like the new thing. Like, okay, here's the new thing. Go do the new thing. Yes. But what about something that came from here like that rather than here like that?
We don't see that enough. Yes, that's my concern. This is the new thing. Now, the lawyers. Very great city to be a lawyer advocate in. In the schools every day because somebody decided that something was discriminatory and it fits the law.
Would you, as an educator, if somebody made you king for a day and you could write the disciplinary policy for America, but if that were to happen, would you write a zero tolerance policy, or would you write something else? Okay, so
Exactly right.
so you got an idea of what it might be, and I bet you a lot of your colleagues.
I also understand why it was written. I
Yeah.
understand the intent.
Yeah.
But the outcomes don't match. Just concern myself that will not match what we wanted. Because on the ground, the trust that is required in a building, the kind of culture that needs to be present in a building to really keep these things from happening, isn't the work that's being done nationally.
That's
Not
why, that's the trust. If there's something that is clear, That's what we have to actually attack, to try to create the bottom-up, community-based professionalism and trust. Because as parents and teachers and communities trusted each other to do the best we can collectively do for our children, we wouldn't actually be having this conversation.
We only have time for one more.
Valen Jordan. I'm a doctoral student. And you spoke about.
Get closer to the
Sorry.
mic.
You spoke about, well, you've all spoken about the racial disparities that exist in schools, and you responded to someone about not talking about the black-white paradigm. But I'm interested in how you would, I might have misunderstood that, but I'm just interested in how you would engage scholars who ascribe to critical race theory or critical white studies and how they think about the teacher's racial identity impacting the classroom.
No, I thought I was clear in saying, look, we're not post-racial or anything, right? We have a society that has racism in it, and it's mostly caught up in institutions and in people's discretion. There is overt racism too. We know that. I'm not declaring an end to that. But what I'm saying though is that it's not exactly the same as our parents and grandparents' experience, right? There are no signs anymore. And another new dynamic is that there's a lot of people caught up in these systems that are not serving them, that are not people of color, right? I'm not. So does that?
No, I
You still?
understand that. So
Oh,
while you
all right.
talk about students, poor white students,
Yeah.
the majority, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, the majority of our teachers in this country have white middle class women. I think there is a racial identity that.
They're not so middle class anymore.
But the majority of them happen to be white women, and there is research that's out there that talks about how teachers need to engage themselves in thinking about their racial identity and how that impacts.
Let me answer your question. I get your question now.
I was just wondering.
I don't think that I'm not here to like disrupt critical race or theory or anything. It's still worthwhile area to look at, and there are ideas that come out of that school of thought that still have a lot of power and usefulness as we analyze the current situation. But what I would say is probably any critical race theorist would say, and I'd love to know what the professor thinks about it. It may be increasingly complicated by the fact that, this white kid with the bag, with the nickel sack or whatever they call it nowadays. I mean, he's somehow caught up in this thing as well.
Racial identity,
Right.
by no means is monolithic, right? But at some point or another, there is some conversation that needs to be had in our teacher education programs.
I don't think anybody said different. I don't think anybody said any different.
As a matter of fact, I was just going to say that was one of the points that was in Randy Weingarten's remarks, was that teacher professional development had to include some sorts of cross-cultural understanding, and yeah.
But I do think the larger question that you're raising, which is a question that we've been fighting for, is it is very disturbing right now that in the last few years we've actually seen there are many more younger teachers, but there are many fewer African American teachers, and there are many fewer Latina teachers. And there are really many fewer male teachers. And I think that the part of what we've tried to do is we've lost some of the things, like in New York City and in Baltimore, we used to have very robust career ladder programs where we would have people from communities go to college, become teachers, work as assistant teachers, and have those kind of career ladders. And I do think that there needs to be a lot more attention about how we recruit and retain and diversify our teaching staff. I think it becomes something so that's something that we as a union have fought for, and are now, the Shanker Institute is now doing some studies on it, because some of us have observed this, but that's something as well. But I think part of what, at least, I don't want to put words in Keith's mouth, but I'll put them in my own mouth, what I've, at least as as someone who's has tried to fight for social and economic justice for the last quarter of century or so, I'm seeing the class issues being very, very dominant right now. Race issues are still incredibly important and still complicated in schools sometimes, but the class issues are the ones, the economic wage gaps, the increase in poverty as we are at the 50th anniversary of the War on Poverty, is something that I would hope that all of us collectively will work on, as Martin Luther King said in the March on Washington, that we have to be about jobs as we are about all of the other discrimination issues. Thanks very much.
Thank you
everybody.
very much.
And I read